So firstly, a disclaimer about the 360 developer. It's not a technical talk per se. There may be some in there. It's a reflection of my experiences, so chew the meat, spit out the bones. And I wrote down this at Rubyfuza 2016. A talk is not great by and of itself, but by the ideas and actions it accrues. And so today I just hope to leave you some handfuls of purpose, and let's hope it's a good one. So by way of an outline, I'm just going to explain some of my journey, the problem space. Developers love problems. That's how we get paid. And what is the 360 developer? I just want to record that we have started a bit late. The 360 developer consists of three main pillars, which will be covering knowledge skills, personal skills, and functional skills. So let's get right to the problem. I had about 4 major changes in my life that were quite painful. The one was I went from business management to Linux administrator to statically typed developer, C# developer for 8 years, and then I switched to Ruby. The Ruby change was a hard one, and it was a big move as well. And I have Rory to thank for that, wherever he is. The first problem I had was I had a personality conflict with my mentor. It was always not a good thing. I had no context for Agile. When I was a C# developer, we were spike and stabilize masters. Because of the nature of the product and the industry we were in, it was feature by feature comparison and race. So we were going up against the big guns. There were 6 of us developers, and we were just pushing features, spike, stabilize, and that's what it was. And so we were being introduced to concepts or thoughts like Agile was refreshing and both new. And then the switch to static, from static to dynamic, not really so much of a concern. The hardest thing was going into a team of experts. So I had 8 years of C# experience, this whole body of knowledge I've developed, and now I come into a space where I was now almost a junior by way of knowledge. And so I had analysis paralysis, didn't know what to do, kind of stuck, like, oh, am I worth anything? Imposter syndrome. And I stopped for a moment. This was about 2 years ago, and I asked myself 2 fundamental questions, and I believed that's what it came down. How could I upskill myself effectively and efficiently to make maximum impact for business today? Then my imposter syndrome problem was I in fact a senior developer? And so 2 years of strategizing and thought, inception, not the movie, but within my own head, I came up with a mental model, which I'll discuss just now. But just stepping back to my view of coding, I see code as poetry, and no, this is not the WordPress thing. Poetry for me is defined as it is a form of literary work, of expression, of feeling, of ideas with certain intensity, with use of a distinctive style and rhythm. This is exactly how I see code. We each have our own expression. It's at different intensities and with a rhythm that's uniquely our own. And it harnesses all of us, harnesses all of us as a person. It also, code evokes emotion. And man, I've historically written some bad poems. But through writing lots of bad poems, I've always desired mastery. And the 2 drivers for my mastery is simple. Why create if it cannot be enjoyed? Why create if it's not pleasing to someone or something? And man, coding is insanely hard. So my pursuit of mastery has been for the longest time. And yet through the whole process, I never stopped to ask myself and clarify what that actually meant. What does the pathway look like? What are the guideposts to know that I'm making progress? How do I know I'm actually even getting there? And there's one approach which I had was scrambling around in the dark, hoping eventually I'll make my way out to the tunnel, using time plus opportunity plus experience, and eventually I'd get there. But it wasn't quite working because I was choosing bad companies to work for. And so I started to see a pattern as well. I would interview lots of senior devs, and often I'd hear the murmurs once the interview was over. A few other people would comment, that wasn't a senior dev, and they'd be like this giggling and laughing. But they really were senior devs. even though they may not have passed our challenges and the questions we were throwing at them, but in the context, in the domain to which they were in and part of, they had all this business knowledge, and it was specific to that domain, and they were good at it, ahead of others in their company. That's what made them senior. But there was also a lack of vision, which I recognize on my own part as well, the lack of vision of not having transferable and functional skills. And so I thought, how can I get this a better strategy to mastery? You know, perhaps then some of the ideas I came up with was being purposeful around the outcomes, having intent, clear vision, attainable and measurable goals, you know, all the sales pitchy kind of stuff, deliberate practice. And so I started to develop this mental model through time and through more self-introspection and beating myself over the head. I am balding now. So the mental model is what I call the 360 developer. And it's not the stereotype of your socially awkward software developer who likes pizza. I still do like pizza. But it's a developer who consists of a plethora of skills, complementary skills. It's not just the pillar of knowledge, but rather a multiple faceted whole being, a person who can relate to other people. So 360 developer in a nutshell is less about machines, more about people. Less about technology stack, more about problem solving. Less about ego and more about solving business challenges. Less about theory and more about practicing theory. So coming back, 360 developer has 3 core pillars. It's knowledge-based being the first. That's the knowledge we all accrue in performing any task or action. Ruby, data structures, these are nouns. The other side to this is personal traits, personality characteristics that contribute to performing a task. These are based on my experience, who I was, how I've grown as a child, just general experience. These are adjectives, descriptive words, humble, professional, patient, things that I've learned through time. Then there's the functional transferable skills, which is the third pillar. Actions taken to perform a task. These are verbs, listening, leading, problem solving. And so in my mind, I built this model and thought, okay, now, how can I go about addressing these things? Firstly, I mentioned to you already I was misguided. I was only focusing on one pillar, and that was knowledge. Man, if I could know it all, know the design patterns, data structures, know the textbooks, I would have arrived. And somehow doing that and going through that process, I was still lacking the effectiveness I desired. And I'll give you an example of this. I don't know how many of you were at the helm of when TDD started to really come into South Africa and become something people would talk about and business would talk about. And there was this friction of business going, but why, but why? I was at one point in a company where I was trying to bring about this change of TDD and trying to reintroduce it. Even though I had the skill, I was unable to relate to the people, relate to business, to communicate why this was important and why the opportunity cost should go on it. And so communication skills matter, relating to people matter, understanding people matter. And the continual thing that I've seen when developers have tried to bring about change is they either are met with fight or flight. So why did I develop the model? Another reason is software is hard. We live in a knowledge economy, and it's whoever has the most value is the most valued. Whoever has the most knowledge is the most valued. If we look at our industry, software engineering is really immature. Accounting dates back to Mesopotamia, which is thousands of years. And the first programmers really were in the 1800s with the Jacquard loom. And what this was a punch card system for weaving yarn. I mean, this is 1800s, right? Not thousands of years. And so our knowledge domain is immature. And the rate of change in theory and practice is accelerating and rapidly changing. And I love people, sorry, that's a bad way to start. I love when there's this so-called truth and it's projected that software, is a complete science. It's not. We're still learning. And that's why there's so much cost and we're still figuring our way. And every time I produce code, I'm not impressed. It's imperfect, but I'm trying to attain perfection. Just to explain some more of that churn, in the 1950s, from the 1950s, there's been 43 new languages every 10 years. That's new tools, new libraries, new best practices, whole new subset of concepts to think about. Just to explain some package growth, here's a listing of gems, NuGet packages, and NPM. That's 35 new gems every day, 20 NuGet packages every day, 525 NPM packages. That's the churn that's happening in our industry. So this is overwhelming body of knowledge, design patterns, data structures, implementation patterns, architectural patterns, a whole bunch of things that we need to know. So how can I get a handle on this? How can I move forward? I read a book by Josh Kaufman, and it's called The First 20 Hours. And what he put forward was, you could learn anything and be effective enough to get done what you need to get done within your first 20 hours. And I'm just going to give you some of his diluted principles. Plan, think, and assess what you actually want and why. Get expert guidance to better guide you and accelerate your learning. Learn only the skills you need to accomplish what you actually need. That last part, what you actually need. His theory, it's absolutely wonderful. It's worth putting into practice. His whole book is made up of how he's tried this out. In fact, his TED Talk even reveals some of it. So then I combine this with the Pareto principle. 20% of the invested input is responsible for 80% of the results obtained. So, Epiphany 1. Any knowledge domain can be learned quickly and effectively, not mastered. Epiphany number 2, knowing only 20% of the domain that I'm about to enter for a specific project or task delivers me 80% of my results. This started giving me a sense of confidence, some structure, some desire, some will. And a good example of this is at the company I'm at, we had this design pattern revival. I mean, people were talking about design patterns. It was going around design pattern this. I'd speak to different people and they'd be speaking about different design patterns, and I'd feel so insecure. You know, I didn't know that one. I need to go read up on this one. And it was just this whole design pattern entourage world going on here. And I felt overwhelmed. And so I decided to take some of these things and try it. Eat my own dog food, so to speak. And so what I started to do is go speak to some experts. And one expert suggested 4 books, moron. And then I moved away from that, and I thought, what else can I do? Started to speak to some other people, and then I went to go and look at the Git. And I started to look at the people's source code themselves. And what I deduced was they were only using 4 patterns. It wasn't this whole subset of all 23 gang of 4 patterns. It was actually just 4. And even though there was all this churn and all this talk, people weren't using all of them. It was just chatter, just noise. And so I just focused on the 4, and bam, no imposter syndrome. The next thing, Aslam Anme, Uncle Bob, yeah. I'm going to talk about solid. So, you can leave now. So, business faces problems today, and as much as we aspire to be masters, I desire to have some form of mastery. It's tomorrow. But business faces challenges today. And so what we need to do, we need to get something that can work today, be effective for business today to deal with our deficiencies, our inconsistencies, our bad code. And for me, the concept was simple. Build software today sufficiently well to change your mind, to compensate for changing your mind tomorrow. Obviously, punting, solid, and this is just for me. This just has worked for me, just using this. Single responsibility principle, I won't spend a lot of time at this. Code that has one and only one reason to change. This was supposed to be a single-bladed knife. One of the developers got involved, and as you can see, this has completely violated single responsibility. This is what you call a God knife. Then the open and close principle is software entities should be open for extension, but closed for modification. Basically, open for extension is having defined extension points where future functionality can be hooked into existing code and provide new behavior. Closed for modification, simple. When you place in those hooks, they should when you add in this new behavior, there should be no modification to those existing classes. A good example for this is you go into a hardware store and you look for a power saw. And there's all these kinds of different blades. Some are made differently, made of different materials, and they have different shapes, but the interface is the same. The interface is never modified, but there's different behavior. Liskov substitution principle. Replace any instance of a parent class with an instance of any one of its children without creating unexpected or incorrect behaviors. From the author herself, if S is a subtype of T, then object of type T may be replaced with objects of type S without breaking the program. By way of analogy, I have a Lenovo laptop at home. I've had them for years, and my laptop charger packs up. My Lenovo laptop charger packs up. So I remember, you know what, I've had about 5 of these through the years. Let me go to the back of the garage and just pick one. And so I go to the back and I start fiddling and I find a few charges and I come and I'm like, okay, this interface doesn't match, this interface doesn't match. This interface matches. Plug it in and boom, my laptop goes. Side effect is the laptop charger had a high voltage and, well, I didn't compensate for that. Violation, Liskov substitution principle. Next one is interface segregation principle. Clients should not be forced to depend upon interfaces they do not use. Simplistically, if I'm building a CMS, a content management system, I say, you know what, I need a user class. The user class should be able to do CRUD. Creation, read, update, delete. Okay, done that. Okay, my user works perfectly. Now I need a moderator, but a moderator is actually a user. So I'm going to inherit from user. And so now moderator works perfectly. He can update and he can read. But now the side effect of that is obviously he's now inherited the ability to create and delete. Not what I wanted. Then the dependency inversion principle. Firstly, DIP is not DI, and Lost Techies has an excellent article if you want to look at that, where he defends the position, and even Jim Wyrick covered this in his solid talk. So DIP is basically high-level classes. There's 2 states of inversion here. High-level classes should not depend upon low-level classes. Both should depend upon abstractions. The second inversion, abstractions should not depend upon details. Details should depend upon abstractions. So software components, by way of analogy here, if I have some low-level I/O and some classes that I'm going to develop, and I have high-level business objects that I want to make, the traditional approach, start low and then go up. The inversion of that is, no, what I actually want to do is define my high level, create abstraction, and then work to the low level. And now there's the inversion. So my reasons for solid is simple. It's getting a handle on improving today. The whole premise behind solid is making your code adaptable for tomorrow. And that's why it's worth it for me. It's a singular body of knowledge. It's an acronym, easier to stick into your head. Some of them are harder to remember than others. But there's a high return of that knowledge because as you're going through code, it can be there as an ever-present context. Secondly, lastly, it helps you develop your code sniffer. So I just wanted to cover design patterns. That was the other aspect that I wanted to prove on. And I wanted to get a better strategy for design patterns. So I was looking for some feedback, and I decided to trommel through some case studies. The first one I came across, and I just share some highlights from it, was a 2003 study where it's always been punted by the experts that design patterns allow you to have this common vocabulary and improves communication. But these researchers wanted to have some quantitative data towards that. And so they analyzed 1,000 open source projects. And I'm going to segue a bit here to just highlight, when I started reading multiple case studies, I started to see a trend as to the most commonly used design patterns. And from 3 studies, 3 large studies, and 1 really monumental article in from Dr. Dobbs, these were the 4 common patterns that I always saw on the top lists: adapter, command, singleton, and factory. Why is that important? For me, was in trying to grapple and get to design patterns and improve rapidly, I want something that has real-world context. And so this, for me, was a stepping stone. The next, coming back to the 2003 study, this is what it revealed. Design patterns are more likely to be used in bigger development environments. They noticed developers that used design patterns were more likely to add more changes. They made more modifications. The next great study that I'd suggest any of you read if you're interested in design patterns is this one done by IEEE in 2014. It is a massive study and just absolutely worth it. Their whole premise behind it was, what does design patterns do for the stability of classes? And they covered the impact, the variance for that stability for those classes around pattern type, the role the pattern plays, the number of pattern occurrences in which the class participates, and the application domain. So some of the highlights from that was the number of design patterns in which a class participates increases the less stable the class becomes. The next one was just some rough numbers of pattern participation. There was 10,400 classes using a single pattern, 2,700 classes with more than one pattern, or participating in more than one pattern. Top 3 users of patterns, this is the domain, or these are the types of industries that highly use design patterns: audio and video, business and enterprise, and communications. The most stable classes that use design patterns, these design patterns, were singleton, facade, and the most unstable were adapter and proxy. I'm just going to, maybe there's another study, and just because I'm short on time, some of the highlights was, it is not always useful to use a design pattern if they are simpler alternative. That kind of makes sense, right? But their next point is kind of also contradictory. Patterns are sometimes superior to simpler solutions in non-obvious ways and should be used by default. And what they're actually saying here, if you don't understand the trade-offs between the simpler solution and the design pattern, default to the design pattern. And basically, the last one is use common sense software engineering to find the exceptions where the simpler solution is just better. The thing I want to pitch to you now, which is a great skill, is that of good analogies. Kent Beck, I'm not sure how many of you would have attended his 3X talk, but his simple analogy had so much powerful application, and that of 3X. I also enjoyed the analogy of Avdi Grimm in Confident Ruby, where he spoke about functions telling stories, input, performing output, and a failure. And so I wanted to go with an analogy and extend that a bit as why stories are classes. Stories have very specific target audience. It requires a concerted effort to make them readable. Stories have to make sense to be understood. There's good stories and there's bad stories, and they're very easy to pick up. And so I just wanted to fly a bit with this analogy. Here on the right-hand side is some privacy license, the thing we kind of pops up and you go yes to, but you never really read. It's kind of monolithic in a sense. There's a lot of technical legal jargon in it, and it's not something you want to read. And if you do want to get to the parts that matter, you have to sift through quite a bit of information. And so too, you can make this kind of application to monolith classes. The next thing here is a dry story. You'll see it over and over again. And so immediately we have a way to communicate something to someone who lacks knowledge. The next thing is adventure challenge books. I don't know about you, but I loved adventure challenge books when I was a teenager. You know, the basic premise with an adventure challenge book is you get down to the bottom and you get to choose the direction the main character would go. You know, if you want to fight the angry troll, turn to page 137 or page 140. And Here you can see a complete bleeding of implementation. What's happening is if you want to fight the troll, go to this page, but here's what's also happening on that page. And then there's short stories. There's a good short story, and then there's an even better short story, one that's ordered, one that gives you a build-up. First comes the properties in the fields, then the constructors, then the work, then the deconstruction. And then I just wanted to emphasize the power to communicate. The beauty to using analogies is that it allows you to bring an external domain of knowledge that your audience understands and that has its own rules that you can then give to them, and using those rules that they learned in school or university or in life, and they can apply it to what you're showing them as code. There's nothing worse than presenting something and making someone feel stupid. But allowing them to step to your level allows you to communicate something important. The next thing I want to get to is personal traits. There's a tale that I'd like to just share with you. There's two leaders that I notoriously or famously have in my mind. One is a leader who's part of Mensa. He's a genius. And I've seen him at work. He's tried to bring about change, and he struggled. As smart as he was, he struggled because he failed to relate to humans. Well, that was my perspective. There's another leader who had no education, perhaps not as smart, but he was the CEO. He was also the lead developer at the company I was at. He was also a millionaire. He also made multi-million rand deals, but he wrote in VB6 and really crappy code. So he wasn't perfect. But one thing he could do was set a vision, and he could have people follow it. So trying to change the world with our code is a great thing, but there's even greater an opportunity to change our business through how we relate to our colleagues. 360 Developer appreciates people. The 360 Developer appreciates the diversity of thought and allows them to come together and allows all people to bring their knowledge to the table. I'm not by any means saying people without IQ or limited IQ can't change the world. Those developers are rare, but relationships matter. So there's this thing of type safety in the workplace. Ruby has types, strings, symbols, hashes, and arrays. But oftentimes, if we see ourselves as various types, the hash discriminates against the array for being unable to do fast enough lookups. String discriminates against symbols for being too single-minded and immutable, in his opinion. So while there may be all this discrimination going on, all these types are necessary for expressiveness, for problem solving, and for synergy. So last year, I think there was a talk about crucial conversations, and one thing that I took away from that was the thing of mutual purpose. There's a dad who has two daughters, and they're fighting in the toilet, both arrived at the same time, and there's this resource contention. No, I want to go first, no, I want to go first. They spent 30 minutes fighting about who should go first. Eventually, the toilet flushes, they both step out, and the dad comes to them, and he says, you know what, if one of you had just gone and used the toilet, you would have saved yourself 25 minutes. And when there's contention, it's really has to do with a loss of behavior. The real problem is that we've lost our purpose. We've lost our intent. So the next thing I want to get to is the principles of, I'm just going to skip ahead here because I'm short on time. But the next one I want to get to is functional and transferable skills. Actions taken to perform a task. So, as developers, we value problem solving. But do we limit our own abilities to one problem domain? I was involved in a company that was had a very high profit. And they asked me to step in a strategic position where I'd help guide the business. I was also the technical lead. And I was excited by this opportunity. And I would go into the boardroom meetings, but I'd switch off. Because I only wanted to deal with problems that were relative to code. So as soon as the discussion went that way, I'd step up and go, okay, I'm going to contribute now. But what I missed was the opportunity to take my skills and apply it to other domains. Dan North said this in one of his talks in Go to 2016, that we are not at our businesses to be software craftsmen, but we are there to solve business challenges. So, and that's an important thing we need to ask ourselves. Is our primary concern our artistry or becoming masters, or is the primary concern the business and their challenges? And so to you, I pose the question today. Try put yourself out there and try and put yourself in meetings and try and remove the whole personality thing of your ego and trying to focus on how can I be better and how can I be a better developer. Because when you focus on how can I improve the business, you allow yourself to detach and you allow yourself to see, hey, there's a business challenge. How can I take my core strengths and apply it? Friedrich Nietzsche said this, at the bottom, every man knows well enough that he is a unique being only once on this earth, and by no extraordinary chance will such a marvelously picturesque piece of diversity in unity as he is ever be put together a second time. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say, coming back to my last two questions I asked, how do I upskill today? Well, I focus on having a strategy, on being a holistic developer on these three pillars, and having a well-defined vision and executing on that on a daily basis. As to the thing of senior developer, I don't really care. My measure is not that, but three questions. How can I successfully improve on my technical knowledge? How have I improved as a person and with my interpersonal relationships? And lastly, how have I leveraged my strengths to resolve business challenges? That to me is a mark of a developer. This is my mental model, and it's imperfect. It is my own, and I hope you've gotten something out of it. Thank you.